Welcome to Podcast Movement Evolution's 2024.
Oh, this is all very exciting, isn't it? Good morning, good morning. Can I have a big cheer from everybody that did not win an Ambies Award last night? Yay! We're all in this together. We're all in this together. Thank you so much. So what I'm going to talk about today in the chapters today, see podcasts chapters, we're going to have a look back at the last year in podcasting just to put things in context. We've got the Podnews report card so we can find out how individual platforms are doing, and we will find out what's coming next in terms of podcasting as well. Firstly, let me just tell you that Podnews is a daily newsletter, very good, which is covers all of the latest podcast news. We report on stories of our own as well. Just to say, right, I am aware that some of the stuff that I've probably written about you and your company is probably a bad thing. Please don't just bring that up in the bar later, okay? That's all fine. I already know that. I started podcasting in very early 2005. I was working for a radio station at the time, and we launched a best of podcast, which was all automatically generated. It works pretty well. We coined the phrase podvertising, which weirdly never caught on. I don't understand why that is. I think we were getting 10,000 downloads at one point, which was fairly amazing. And I started working in audio, in radio, way back in 1989. I don't know why I'm showing you this, but here I am in 1993. There's me with my DJ name on this photo card. Also on here, somebody that went on to be one of the biggest names of UK radio, a guy called Chris Moyles. And also on here is someone who is in prison for killing somebody. They say that true crime is a winning format, so let's play the game of guess the murderer. No, let's not. Let's not. And my first job in audio was actually using these. Does anybody know what these are? Anybody know what these were used for? Wow, I feel old. Not drugs, no, not drugs. Editing audio, yeah, the razor blade and the splicing tape and the grease pencil. De-umming and de-erring was sometimes accompanied by defingering, which was never a good plan. Anyway, before we get into the numbers, let's look back at the last year in podcasting. It'll help us understand some of the numbers that you'll see. Firstly, AI has been a really big thing. AI was everywhere, from editing tools to replace those razor blades, thank heavens, to host-read ads, to clone voices, and to ad targeting as well. That is, by the way, what I asked an AI program. Please show me an angry-looking Joe Rogan. And that's what I got. YouTube was also a thing as well. Back in March 2022, YouTube spoke here at Podcast Movement Evolutions, but they didn't actually announce anything. 12 months later, in March of last year, YouTube released podcast upload tools. In April, YouTube launched podcasts into the YouTube Music app in the US. In May, Podnews carried an exclusive that YouTube would ingest RSS feeds. In July, YouTube started rolling out those podcasts internationally. In August, speaking at Podcast Movement in Denver, YouTube announced an RSS ingestion tool. In September, Google announced that Google Podcasts was going to close and everything would migrate to YouTube Music. And, well, we've not really heard very much since, really. There seems to be no big push into podcasting yet from YouTube. Podcasting isn't even visible in most countries in the app. But yet, YouTube is still apparently number one for podcasting, certainly one to keep an eye on. It has, though, and let's acknowledge this, been a hard year for many of us in podcasting. Spotify made a total of 2,300 job cuts last year. And they weren't alone. I don't normally make headlines of job cuts because nobody really wants to see them, but many other companies did as well. Sony laying off staff, closing some of their joint ventures, including Broccoli Productions, see what I did there. And companies like Quake Media, launched in 2020 with $2.5 million, they appeared to run out of money as well. And they weren't alone. Leo Laporte's Twit network being affected, job losses at places like NPR. Other large companies ended their contracts early, like Odyssey. And Cast Media were and I have to check my legal notes very carefully here, accused of not paying creators. I was working on that story. I asked the CEO, Colin Thompson, for a comment, and he replied by sending me a link to US libel law, which I thought was nice. I then said, oh, that looks a bit threatening. And he said, no, that wasn't supposed to be threatening. I was just curious myself. I just thought I'd look it up and share it with you. Oh, okay. And then there was the Apple change. 3 weeks after the launch of iOS 17, Apple told us that it had made a small change in how automatic downloads worked. And we were told it was such a small change that I put it as story number 6 in October. But we kept hearing stories that it was actually not a small change. It was a bigger change than that. And it took time for iOS 17 to roll out to all users. But by the time we got to February, those figures showed that most of the large podcast publishers were seeing numbers down by almost a third or more. And that small change cost Acast $7.2 million in contract revaluations. Now, let's be clear, better figures for the industry are a great thing. It was actually the right choice to make, but it did come as a big surprise. And it also has cost jobs in this industry as well. So heads up next time would be super nice. Now, these figures that I'm showing you here are, they're not show by show, they're network by network, and there are various reasons why some of these numbers are changed. So it's not an ideal comparison, but in today's Pod News, I give you an ideal comparison, because I've got some exclusive details from the good folks at Podtrac. For larger shows, downloads are down by about 15%. And for those big shows, health and fitness, worst hit with 40%. Tech shows down by 39%. True crime down by 13%. But here's an interesting thing. Kids podcasts are up year on year, slightly, by 1%. And fiction podcasts have actually seen a 36% increase in downloads over the last year, which is pretty cool, isn't it? You can find a link to all of those categories in today's Pod News, podnews.net/latest. And notwithstanding all of that stuff, it's actually been a really good year for podcasting as well. Spotify has turned a corner and killed the exclusive. Big shows like Joe Rogan, Call Her Daddy, and more now appear in RSS, open RSS, in a new podcast strategy from the company. Exclusives are bad, it turns out, and you only have to ask Daniel Ek, who said exclusivity wasn't aligned with what the creator wanted. Revenue is increasing too. Companies like iHeart and Audioboom and others are seeing revenue going up. Spotify made a profit last year and will do so again. Acast also made a profit at the end of last year. And in a big change last year, the amount of audio that we consume, on-demand audio, is now more popular than live audio. And we are the most trusted people in media, according to the studies. And Apple's announcement about transcripts also means that podcasting is more accessible than it's ever been before. We, the creators, are in control of those transcripts too. And if we create our own transcripts, they appear in other podcast apps as well. New life is then being breathed into podcast apps. Castro has a new owner doing a really good job there. And Podcasting 2.0 has been adding new features to new podcast apps, even Apple. YouTube and other parts of the world are seeing tremendous growth in podcasting as well, with none of the overheating that we've perhaps seen here in the US. And unlike my old world of radio, the fastest growing generation of podcast listeners are young people. So actually, podcasting is in a really great place. So time for the numbers. And this is the best way I've always found to warm up for a big Hollywood star, is to show a lot of slides with a lot of numbers on. So good luck, everybody. Last month, we ran the Pod News Report Card. It's our third annual Pod News Report Card. We asked podcast publishers what they thought about podcast platforms. We reach 30,000 people every day. So we asked you a lot of questions. We got a lot of answers. And today I get to show you what people said. And the first question that we asked was about apps. You could vote for other apps in here as well: Overcast, Podcast Addict, Index, Pocket Casts doing really, really well in the votes. I'm going to focus just on the big ones today, but it's the same apps, which is good, in the same order, but everybody has gone down slightly. And I wonder whether that is because new podcast apps are showing that you can do other things in podcast apps. And perhaps some of these apps aren't necessarily stepping up to all of those. But Apple Podcasts still there at number 1, pulling away from Spotify. Our main focus isn't actually the scores, it's what people say. And in this particular case, the comments that we got from that actually said, we want comments in our apps. We want live comments inside Apple Podcasts. We want comments. We like the comments, the Q&As inside Spotify. YouTube wins because you can have your audience interact with you via comments. Comments are a big thing, which is a useful thing to pass back to the app developers as well. But our main, we also looked at directories and how easy it is to get listed in directories. Spotify doing really well here. The Podcast Index also doing well here, although the Podcast Index got some fewer votes than Spotify did. But Apple has dipped. And why has Apple dipped? Well, it turns out that the ID system is the thing that everybody finds really complicated, and it can just be a little bit too complicated to add a show, and I would probably agree with quite a lot of this. Spotify is, I would suggest, much easier than Apple is in terms of adding a show. How about analytics and stats? Well, Apple wins, again, with Spotify and YouTube being very close behind, but YouTube gets some really positive comments about its analytics. Best in class, some people are saying. One person at the bottom here, amazing, amazing, kind of scary. What's probably not understood is that Apple's stats only measure Apple. They don't measure everybody else. So absolutely, they won't be the same as somebody like Chartable. And I think that this is a recurring theme, and I wonder how we can help educate people how the stats actually work. Earning money, well, Apple offers paid subscriptions. This is probably why they're nice and high again this year. Podcasting 2.0's value for value streaming is highly ranked by those who voted for it. Theoretically, YouTube could be quite high here, but for whatever reason, the numbers are lower, and perhaps that's because it's actually quite difficult to make money from YouTube. You need a really large audience to end up doing that. Innovation, Apple and Spotify doing well here. Podcast Index, of course, as ever, doing very well in the new podcast namespace. I suspect that Apple's score here has increased probably because of Apple's transcripts. It's probably worthwhile also mentioning that Podcast Index got about as many votes as Spotify did here. So it's interesting to know that people understand what it is and how it can help. And no surprise also that Podcast Index and Podcasting 2.0 does well when people are rating these platforms on whether they are supporting open standards. And once more, Apple increasing due to its support on transcripts, you might assume. But take a look at YouTube on these numbers. As more people use it for podcasts, more people have their own views as to whether or not YouTube supports standards or not. Standards, as this person says, are super important. And I keep on banging on about how useful a podcast standards group would be that all of the industry works on. And I hope that we see a bit more of that this year. Finally, before the overall scores, creator relations, are they good to work with? Is there lots of information about how to work with them? Apple Podcasts made great strides with this last year, and they've maintained their score this year, which is good, as the #1 team. Podcast Index has done well, but only got half the votes as Apple Podcasts, so just worthwhile bearing that in mind. But here, a big drop again for YouTube. In fact, more people voted just with 1 star for YouTube here than for anybody else. Why might that be? Well, again, we go into the comments, and yeah, these comments aren't very positive. YouTube seems to have quite the communication problem. You see, people are reading them now, aren't they? Their ad policy is not a thing people like. Overall, it's a dumpster fire, a non-conformant mess, some people say. And there were a lot of responses. Here's another page full of them. It's a joke, confusing, awful. One person says, not unreasonably, well, they'll probably close their podcast service sooner or later, so why bother? And I think that that's probably a fair comment, given that Google Podcasts only lasted 5 years before the company closed it. I don't think it's a problem with the product. I think it's more a problem with communication, and I'm sure that YouTube will be better after they see some of this stuff. And the final scores, no change with what we think overall. Apple Podcasts still rules the roost, with Spotify seeing a bit of an overall drop last year. But all of the big platforms have asked for a full briefing from me on the more than 750 comments that we've got from podcast creators in our report card. So we're sharing all of the comments, no names, you're okay, but we're sharing all of the comments on all of the voting data. We're actually sharing which country you're in as well, because actually there's quite a lot of difference, for example, in Amazon Music, if you're in Europe versus the US, and various other things. So all of this data is going to the right people at Apple, at Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, and thank you for taking part if you did. But finally, what's next? Well, podcasting over the last year celebrated its 20th anniversary in the last 12 months. And I thought, yeah, let's give ourselves a round of applause, 20 years. And I thought to myself, well, I mean, I could say something about the future, and actually the fact that the future is already kind of here, because we already have some really good apps. Not very many people use them yet, but some really good apps with some really good ideas and innovations and stuff like that. I thought, well, I could say all of that. And then I thought, well, actually, it should be one of the inventors of podcasting who says all of that. The person who wrote a blog post that led to the start of this movement. Someone who is still working in podcasting now and enabling some of the most exciting new things for podcasting. So on video, please welcome, with a special message for Podcast Movement Evolutions, Adam Curry.
Thank you very much, James. Hey, everybody. It's Adam Curry here, and it was a little over 20 years ago that Dave Weiner and I invented podcasting. And I got to tell you, the choice of RSS turned out to be a really good one, as RSS truly is the honey badger of digital distribution. No matter what they try, they cannot kill it. Now, RSS also has a lot of flexibility built into it, and with that, you can continue innovating with features and functionality. So about 3 years ago, my partner Dave Jones and I created an open podcast index for any developer to access and build on, and the result was amazing. Over 100 developers who've now built over 65 apps and services today. And one of the 27 new features includes a built-in monetization model that allows the listener to return value to any podcaster in real time. And we're seeing about $20,000 monthly flowing through this ecosystem. In addition, just recently, we've enabled independent artists to have their songs played on podcasts and also get paid in real time when the track is played on the podcast. It's opened up an entire new category of podcasts for playing music, something the legacy entertainment system simply does not allow. And you can find over 30 new player apps at newpodcastapps.com. They're all completely compatible with your existing feeds. And I got to tell you, after 2 decades since my first daily source code, I'm still just as excited for the future of podcasting and what new creative ideas you'll come up with. Thank you all for what you're doing with podcasting. Have a great conference, and go podcasting.
Adam Curry, everybody. What a guy. Now, you can see more data from the Podnews report card on our website at podnews.net/report card. Don't go there yet, because I haven't done it. Probably later today. And we'll also continue working with the platforms to make things better. But as I say every single year, we, the people who make the podcasts, are important. Podcast publishers like us see we're the lifeblood of this movement in media consumption. The best way for any of these platforms to improve is to listen to us, to listen to the podcast movement. So thank you for your time, and keep listening. Thank you.
When Evolutions 2024 wraps up, that only means the fun has just begun. Because this August, we're bringing you the biggest podcast movement event ever. Join us August 19th through the 22nd for the 11th annual podcast movement as we do it better than ever in Washington, D.C. So make plans to join us this August for the biggest week in podcasting. It's Podcast Movement 2024. We'll see you there.